thank you guys for having me. Yeah, this is the first time that I'm doing something like this on Zoom, but I've been involved in a lot of Zoom meetings and a lot of the telehealth visits that I'm doing are through Zoom as well. But I think just to give you a little bit more background, and hopefully you guys have questions because it's more of kind of understanding where I came from and why I'm even speaking to you guys. So I was a couple of years back in your shoes. I was an undergraduate major at UCLA um, as a neuroscience major. And back then, this was just when UCLA had started. It was in the early years of its neuroscience major. And I think our entire cohort at that time was about 60 folks. And I think you guys have a lot more right now. So it was a lot smaller. I'm not even sure if we had, I think we had the Neuroscience Undergraduate Society, but it was much, much smaller, but and not as well coordinated like what you guys are doing. So I, I have a long background there at UCLA, and unfortunately for the freshmen, I don't know if there are any freshmen here, but I'm wondering if you guys have gotten to see the neuroscience campus or the Gonda building or any of that stuff, because a lot of that stuff when I was there, it was just coming up. The life science building that you guys have right now, that was a different building. It was an older building, and so when I went to campus last year for this same talk, it was quite a treat to see all the different buildings. And as you may have heard from folks, that UCLA has been under construction since it was founded, with the exception of I think World War II. World War II is the only time in UCLA's history that it hasn't been under construction. So just to put that in perspective, every time I go back, there's something new, and every time I was, even when I was there, there's always something new happening. Um, but I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my background and kind of my interest in neuroscience and how I came to psychiatry. And again, hopefully there's questions, or if you guys have any thing to add, I'd be happy to talk about it. But I got interested in neuroscience early on as a high school student. There was at that time, there was just this thing that was going on, and it was the decade of the brain under President Clinton and earlier President Bush. And so I had gotten interested early. When I came to UCLA, I was already a neuroscience major. And honestly, while at UCLA, I had seen myself going into research. You guys know this probably, that UCLA's neuroscience program is very heavily neurobiologically based. There are other programs that might be a little bit more social science based or psychology based, but UCLA's program is very much steeped in neurochemistry and neurobiology. And so that was my background, and I had seen myself going into research in neuroscience. When I had graduated, I had thought that, well, I was going to do some research in one of the labs, and this wasn't, when I was applying anyway, it wasn't a good time because a lot of the labs had gotten cutbacks during one of the administrations. NIH had lost a lot of funding, and IMH had lost a lot of funding, and so it wasn't the best time to be doing lab work. So it was a difficult period for me. And at that time, when I was in, I forget what's the building called that you guys have next to Gonda. I was doing research there, the immunocytohistochemistry lab. But
Is it the Neuroscience Research Building, the NRB? Is that what you're referring to?
is that the one right opposite of Gonda?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So that was the one where I was at, and there, the lab that I was working at, my mentor there, she had advised me. She said, "Look, if you go into medicine, at least you'll have a stable job, and you can always do research. You can't, with research, there's always questions of cuts and funding, and all this stuff. It's you have to be fighting your way through and trying to push your political agenda. At least with medicine, you can always do research, but I mean, it wasn't the best answer, but it was a practical answer at that time, and I'd still seen myself going into neuroscience, basic neuroscience research later on down the line. But having gone through that, again, when I went through medical school, and I will, frankly tell you that for me, at least, it was a very disheartening experience. I found it not just emotionally or academically challenging. I mean, I think that part wasn't as hard, but I was disillusioned with the healthcare system in this country. When I thought about medicine, I thought, well, it's supposed to be about caring. It's supposed to be about doing the right thing. And what it boiled down to, and much of it still boils down to, what is the insurance dictating? How do systems work? And so it was a difficult experience for me at that time. And I ended up doing a public health degree at Brown University in Rhode Island, after medical school, because I thought I might not do any clinical practice. I might just go into something of a public administration. But again, like, I had that neuroscience kind of interest. So even throughout my years in medical school, the one thing that I knew going in was that if I was going to do something, it was going to be related to the brain. So I thought that either this was going to be um, neurology, neurosurgery, or psychiatry. I knew that from the beginning. I knew that I was going to do one of those three, because the brain was what interested me. The brain was what I did a neuroscience undergrad degree, and so I wasn't really much interested in the rest. Kidneys are fascinating, but they don't excite me. And so that was kind of my take. And going through the rotations, not that I think neurology and neurosurgery aren't important, because I do think they're important, and I thought neurosurgery was very, very cool. It's just I realized quickly that it wasn't my personality. There's a certain personality that fits into neurosurgery, and the maybe 10 hours on your feet and doing microsurgery wasn't exactly my cup of tea. And so I realized quickly that neurosurgery wasn't going to be what I was going to be interested in. With neurology, my initial interest in medicine was probably through neurology, because of reading all of Oliver Sacks's books, and again through the neuroscience, the stuff. I'm happy to report that a lot of the same professors that I had, when I went there last year, apparently you guys still have the same professors, and so that was kind of nice to hear. And those were the guys that inspired me when I went. So I thought about neurology, but for me at least, it seemed more of a diagnostic practice of medicine, but there was less treatment involved. The treatment aspects of neurology often came down to physical therapy or neurosurgery, but it was mostly sort of academic and kind of doing more of the diagnostic aspect. So that left psychiatry, and you know, I had I had doubts, but at the same time, there was the thing about, for me at least, for psychiatry, was that it encompassed a lot of my other interests. So even when I was at UCLA, I had an interest in writing. I loved creative writing, and I loved reading. And there were the aspects, when a lot of us are going through that decision-making process, where do we go next? There was a small part of me that thought maybe I'd want to do the law. It wasn't a big part, and I don't think I ever took it seriously, but there's still a small part of me that thought maybe I want to do the law. And so when I came to psychiatry, when I did my psychiatric rotation, I had the neurosciences, I had medicine, I had philosophy, I had care. It had public health, because a lot of psychiatric illnesses, is about preventative care and public health. Um, I was working in systems, and I also found that I could read literature. I could and still be informed about psychiatric practice. So that was, for me, that was a big part of it, was that you learn about not necessarily psychiatric illness, but you learn about human behavior, even reading Shakespeare. And I love that. And so that's where I got that kind of like, okay, well, psychiatry could be the right fit for me. And specifically, I think this is something that, for some of you guys that I have talked to, I would really recommend, is cultivating your entire interests. It's going to look good for your medical school applications if you do apply to medical school. But even aside from that, even if you're interested in research, it makes you a well-rounded person, regardless of whatever job you go into. And so for me, one of the things that I like doing, I grew up in LA. I like watching movies. And one of the cool things, I think one of my favorite movies, growing up, was Hannibal Lecter. And if any of you guys have watched Silence of the Lambs or Hannibal, Anthony Hopkins' portrayal there. It's in, it's riveting, and he's a psychiatrist, and so I was like, wow, this is really cool. Um, and Jodie Foster's character also, they don't quite say what she does, but she's seen to be a psychiatrist because she does some profiling and she's an MD. Um, so I thought from an outside perspective that was really cool. And then when I got into psychiatry, I remember there were a couple of cases that really blew my mind. And even to further specialize in child psychiatry specifically, there was one case I remember where there's a 12-year-old girl who had come into the clinic, and she basically was having acting out behaviors. She was problematic. She was causing a lot of problems for school, and she was hitting other kids, and she's causing problems at home. And one of the biggest things for her was that she was jealous of her 1-year-old daughter. So this is a 12-year-old girl with a 1-year-old daughter, and for my, it took me a while to process this. I'm like, of course, she's a 12-year-old girl. She's jealous of her 1-year-old daughter. That makes sense. But why does she have a 1-year-old daughter? So these were the systems kind of issues that I quickly for me it was exciting. Not like just from a diagnostic standpoint, but that you could intervene on so many different levels. When you're thinking of psychiatry, you're not just thinking of the neurobiology of what's going on. You're not just thinking of pharmacological treatments. You're also thinking of what kind of treatments you're going to do for the school, and what kind of recommendations you're going to have for the parents. If they're involved in the legal or foster care systems, how are you going to manage that? So there was this entire way of thinking that was very different, and it wasn't narrow. For me, again, it was really, it encompassed a lot of my interests, and so I was excited by that. And that's one of the things that pushed me further. Um, I'm not going to go much into forensic psychiatry, except to say that forensic psychiatry is the area of psychiatry that deals with the law. And so folks, usually this is the point where I'm asking you guys if you know what forensic psychiatry is. And unfortunately, through the Zoom platform, I don't think it's the best way to go. So I'll just tell you basically that it's anything related to psychiatry and the law. So when you have folks that are either being tried for insanity, um, custody cases, anything that has a mental health component to it, there's usually a forensic psychiatrist who's doing part of the evaluation. So if at least you guys could raise your emoji hands on this, how many of you guys are familiar with the I forget his first name, but Holmes from Aurora, Colorado? Anybody knows the case from Aurora, Colorado? Holmes, James Holmes? I think it's James Holmes. Nobody? Well, a couple of years ago when the Batman movie came out, I forget which one. This one was the one with Christian Bale. Somebody had dressed up as the Joker and had gone into a theater in Aurora, Colorado and shot up people. Ring a bell for anybody? No hands? I see some nods. Okay. All right. Well, that's so. For one thing, I think an interesting tidbit on that is that this gentleman, James Holmes, he was a neuroscience major. For those of you guys that didn't know that, he went to UC Riverside, and then ended up going to Colorado for his PhD. Never completed his PhD in Colorado. But a case like that. So there was a forensic psychiatrist who was involved. There was actually a couple of them that were involved in evaluating. If you guys might be familiar with a little bit more recently, how about the Boston Marathon bombings? Okay, so Tsarnaev, that was another case where there's a forensic psychiatrist and a psychologist involved in evaluating him to see if he was unduly influenced by his brother. So there are different kinds of questions that forensic psychiatrists get involved. It's not strictly medicine because you're not treating the patient, and they're not your patient, but it's anything to do with psychiatry and the law. And again, going to my interest in philosophy and law and in sort of ethical questions, how does society define insanity? How does society define what constitutes mental illness? That's always been an area of interest of mine and still is. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to pursue training in forensic psychiatry. For example, I think that something that maybe some of you guys might be able to relate to is when you guys are multitasking and are unable to complete assignments, is that ADHD, or is that something that's societally caused? What are the evolutionary origins of psychiatric illness? So there's a lot of things, how we live our lives does it contribute to psychiatric illness? What would a public health intervention look like? I think it's a lot easier if I told you guys to think about a public health intervention in cardiology with something related to the heart. It's a lot easier to think and wrap your heads around, right? Something basic would be like managing obesity or having healthy food options available near folks' community, the neighborhoods. But it's a little bit harder to think about when we think about mental health interventions. These are the kinds of things that I think are still left. One thing that I hope from you all, and hopefully for everybody out there who's interested in the neurosciences, is translating all this stuff clinically. So sometimes, and I've heard this story about mental illness is not well understood or the neurobiology is fuzzy. That's not true. We've had the neurobiology of fear, which is the basis for all anxiety disorders. We've had the neurobiology and neurochemistry of memory for a long time, even since I was an undergrad. So this is not really new stuff. What hasn't happened is it hasn't been translated clinically. And this is what where I hope, at least in the future, that the gap gets narrowed. That it's not just about knowing what's going on in your brain with memory or with fear-based circuitry or autism, but it's also how do you do something about it. And that's where I think psychiatry has lagged, the neurosciences have lagged, is actually having applications. I think we're at a very exciting time. I thought we were an exciting time back then, but I think even now we're at a very exciting time with novel treatments. For those of you that are following the news in psychiatry, you might have heard about stuff in psychedelic research. Hopefully you're not experimenting with it just yet, but there's a lot of research on psychedelics that's out there that looks very exciting. And I think there's also a lot of stuff with technology that hopefully is going to change the way we look at psychiatric illness. I think it's easier with neurology because neurology specifically it's more anatomically based, where psychiatry tends to be at more the molecular level or circuitry based. And so it's been, the understanding of how illness comes to be has been a little bit slower, and it hasn't been as well defined as other areas of medicine. But I think we're getting there. And hopefully within, the next couple of years, we're going to be far advanced because it's an exciting time, at least for me, being a psychiatrist. I think I'm going to leave it there. And then, if anybody has questions or if anybody has thoughts, I'd love to hear it and I'd love to chime in. But
yeah, we can open the floor to maybe on the spot questions. And if not, we have a bunch of pre-submitted questions, so I can get into that list if nobody has questions right now.
I have a question. How do you suggest that we stay informed on like some of the treatments and stuff that you were talking about in psychiatry? Like, do you have any specific sources that you would recommend us look into?
yeah, I mean, it's going to depend on what you're specifically interested in. If there's a specific psychiatric illness you're interested in, a specific area that you're interested in, I think if you're looking specifically for neuroscience-based research, the best journal for that is the Journal of the American Medical Association Psychiatry, JAMA Psychiatry. That's the best one for neuroscience-based studies. If you're looking for more translation, like clinical translation, it would be the American Journal of Psychiatry. Those are the best references in general to look for. There's other more neuroscience-based journals that I think you guys probably already get out there. You probably have available to you at UCLA that you're seeing wherever you go to the offices. Those are less translation-based, and so those aren't something that necessarily I would look at because they're not as clinically applicable. So if you can get there's resources for autism specifically. There are resources for ADHD specifically. But if you're looking for a broad, journal, those are the two that I would recommend looking at. You can get the digest; they have podcasts, and so you can just kind of go on the podcast and sign up for the podcast.
Thank you.
Mhm.
I had a question too. I thought it was really interesting how you talked about like how you really liked movies and like Hannibal Lecter, and it reminded me of like I listened to a lot of podcasts about like true crime. But I just thought, I don't know how, because you talked about like forensic psychology and like kind of how that like is similar or like relates to those interests, and like I was just wondering how, like as a forensic psychologist, like do you work for the government or do you just kind of like, I don't know, how does it work?
Let me let me clarify one thing. I'm not a forensic psychologist. I'm a forensic psychiatrist, and so there is that one difference, and it does play into a little bit of the job stuff that you're talking about. So, for example, psychiatric ethics, because we're physicians, it precludes us from doing harm. And so, for example, the American Psychiatric Association would take a very strong stance against us doing anything related to torture or psychological torture. Whereas the American Psychological Association, I think they've come up with something recently, but at least until recently, you weren't forbidden. I don't think psychologists want you to go torture. I'm not saying that, but I think you weren't necessarily explicitly forbidden by your profession. And so there's slight difference there. And to the answer to the other part of your question about how do you get, so if you were interested in forensic psychology, how do you do it? You go through med school, or a forensic psychiatrist goes through med school. You have to do psychiatry, and then it's a fellowship on top of that where you do an additional year of forensic psychiatry. For forensic psychology, you would go through a PhD or a PsyD in psychology, and then you would do additional training in like your intern year. You do it in forensic psychology. Forensic psychology is a lot more test-based, so you do a lot of testing of these folks. Forensic psychiatry is not always test-based. So I work in juvenile justice, but primarily what I do is treatment. I don't do evaluations, which is the other piece you're talking about. So when you're talking about, forensic, it's a big area. And when you're talking about child forensic work, it's also very different, because child forensic work, you're working on custody. So you wouldn't do that as an adult. You're doing custody cases. You're also doing cases related to the child's age of crime. So in California, we have very few crimes, but we do have some crimes that are automatically you're tried as an adult. In other states, there are a lot more crimes that you can be tried as an adult. So usually, I think the easiest one is either sexual assault or murder. Those you can automatically be tried as an adult in a lot of states. It doesn't matter what age you are, you'd automatically be tried as an adult unless someone brings up your age. And so that's where a forensic psychiatrist or a forensic psychologist would get involved and talk about the child issues, the issues related to development that might serve that young person better being treated in juvenile justice as opposed to in the adult legal system. So there, I know I'm not quite answering your question, but it's a broad question. And if you're wondering about, are there folks who do what they do on like CSI or on, there are folks, it's not as glamorous as what they show, but there are folks who certainly do stuff. Another famous case, and if you're talking about working for the government, you can work for the government as a psychiatrist, but usually if you're working as a consultant to the government for a psychiatrist, you're providing treatment. You're not doing evaluations. You're not doing psychological profiling. Some do, but it's very, very uncommon. Forensic psychologists are usually the ones, if they're working for the government, who are doing psychological profiling or providing that kind of data. But if I'm working for the FBI or if I'm working for the CIA, probably what I'm doing is providing treatment to either the agents themselves or to their families. Or if I'm working for the State Department, abroad, I'm providing to the ambassador staff, the ambassador, their families. That's what I'd be doing as a psychiatrist. A psychologist, it's slightly different. They might be doing stuff related to like strategy. So it'd be, slightly different how they would be working.
Thank you.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm currently a neuroscience student, and in our neuroscience classes, we'll go over how certain symptoms are induced by, such as like damage to a nucleus of like the hypothalamus or the thalamus or something like that, and how that can cause like behavioral changes and whatnot. Same thing with the amygdala. So I'm wondering, in these certain situations where forensic psychiatrists get involved, could there ever be, are there ever situations where it'll be so in depth where they'll actually look at the internal structures of one of the individual's brains just to see if that could potentially be a reason as to why they acted in a certain way, or does it never get that technical?
Yeah, I mean, and so you're getting into a very complicated area of psychiatry. I mean, just because it's not just, at that point, it's not just medicine or psychiatry, it's also, you're talking about the law. And the law is something very different from medicine. And so, and what I mean by that specifically, for example, when we're talking about the insanity defense, right? Like that's one of the things that you could be talking about, insanity defense. There is no such thing as insanity in medicine. There's no diagnosis saying you're insane or you're crazy. That's not a medical diagnosis. That's a legal term, insanity. And so insanity is defined legally. It's not defined medically. It's not the equivalent of saying you have schizophrenia. So it's a different kind of thing. But when you're talking about damage, you can, depending on the jurisdiction. That's why I'm bringing in the law, is that every jurisdiction has a slightly different standard, and it has to depend on the judge whether there is precedential value, there's value to what you're bringing in as an expert witness, or if it can be prejudicial. One of the problems with bringing in brain scans, and people do bring in brain scans into the courtroom, but if you're a lay jury person and you're seeing a brain scan, here's this expert, here's this psychiatrist or neurologist or neuroscientist who's telling you that damage in that region of the brain is associated with psychopathological behavior, pathological behavior. As a jury person, what are you likely to think?
I mean, you're probably just likely to believe them or whatever there's because you don't have information on it.
So that's what we're calling a prejudicial. There's the potential to prejudice and bias the jury. Is it going to help? Because for them, this might look like, well, this person obviously had no control over their actions. If there's damage to that part of the brain, and that's why they acted this way, the term that we would use, and maybe you've heard about this at least in biology, it's called biological determinism. That's sort of the phrase that we would use for that. But you don't want to oversell like brain scans. Juries love brain scans, judges love brain scans. And why do they love brain scans? Because they're cool, and they think they're learning something, and there's all these funky colors, and you don't know anything. Most people don't know anything about the brain, right? And so it can certainly have an effect. And if I was a defense attorney, I would love to use a brain scan. I would want my expert to use a brain scan. But does it actually have value is a different question. And this goes to what you might not think of in neuroscience, in undergrad neuroscience, or even neuroscience research at the graduate level. But from a legal perspective or a clinical perspective, it's the G to I problem. It's the group to individual problem. And so, has anybody heard of that group to individual problem? I mean, if you do research, you're going to find that. It's not, it's not just related to the law, but if you do any kind of research, so the basic premise is that just because you found this in a group of people, does it apply specifically to this one person? Just because, does everybody who has damage to the hippocampus or the amygdala, every single person, do they react in the same exact way? That's what you're gonna have to answer. And obviously the answer is usually no, right? Because there has to be very precisely defined damage, and it's almost never that any two people have damage in the exact same way, or so it's hard to do that kind of research. Does that answer your question, at least partly?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So I have a question related to, oh, sorry, Joey, did you want to go?
You could go.
Okay. So yeah, I had a question about like practicing during the pandemic. And so like over the past few months, how has your approach, I guess, to psychiatry changed over like around COVID, and how, like, what kind of trends do you see with patients, and how do you like approach the whole like media, or what's the word? The like appointments over Zoom is what I mean, or over like video.
Yeah. So I mean, this was part of, at least part of my discussion on NPR was about this, like school reopenings, and there's no easy answer. The one thing that I can tell you is that there's a lot more demand for psychiatric services, and so there are a lot of folks that are requesting psychiatric services since the pandemic, specifically. So it's been different. It's been unique. Like strangely or not strangely, there's other areas of medicine where the demand has gone down because people are simply not going out to see their physicians, or things that they would have been elective, like I guess like something like dermatology or plastic surgery, their demand has gone down. Whereas psychiatric services, I think people are just very anxious because of what's going on. So the demand has gone up, and the request for psychiatric services has gone up. I think that's a trend that was happening even before the pandemic. I think as people become more, even when I was an undergrad, I don't think people sought out psychiatric services or psychological services as readily as they do today. I think your generation is a lot more comfortable with this stuff than previous generations were. So that's something that's a trend that was already happening. I think the pandemic has sort of accelerated that trend, and a lot of it has to do with people are more comfortable seeking psychiatric help because there's a lot more public awareness. But it's also, if I can do it through the online platforms, this makes it even more convenient. I think that was a barrier to seeking services because you have to go to a place, a psychiatric appointment, a clinic, and so it wasn't always as accessible for folks. And so now everyone can you just sign on to your computer and that's it. So I think there's been an increase in services because of that. The flip side is also true, that it's increased the disparity. So for example, I work in the county system, so I work in the underserved population. For me, a lot of my patients, they don't have good connections. And so when I'm doing appointments with them, I'm having to do it on phone sometimes. It's not even on the video. So that's something that is a challenge for the underserved population. The health disparities are increasing because of the pandemic, and that hasn't been addressed. But as far as seeking services, that's gone up. If you're asking a more subtle or not so subtle question about what my opinion of it is, I hate this. I don't like the video appointments. I would much rather, even for this kind of meeting, I would rather be in person. Because as a psychiatrist, I have a little bit of the old school training where every interaction matters to me. And so when I'm talking to you, your body language is also important for me. The way, when I say something, if you react in a certain way, that tells me something about your interpersonal relationships. It tells me something about how comfortable or how uncomfortable I'm making you feel. And so those kinds of things are not as easy over the video platform. I think at least folks of your generation that I've talked to and the younger folks that I see, they love it. They love just being able to kind of connect on the phone. And so, it could be a generational thing, but I also have never liked telephone. I've never liked texting, and I grew up with that too, but it's not something that I've ever liked. And I think I like increasingly less. I like the in-person interactions, but there is certainly value. And I think this is going to be a permanent change. I don't think this is going to be a temporary thing. I think a lot of folks are going to be, a lot of medicine is going to shift to this realm, or at least a hybrid realm. I don't think that's going to go back necessarily.
I guess kind of a follow-up on that then, because you did bring up how it, like the whole appointments online emphasizes the health disparities that are already like in place. What do you think that like, I guess like as the public, we can't really do much. We're not really qualified to do anything, but what could we like, where could we put our efforts to like try and bridge this gap?
The health disparities? Well,
I guess just like health disparities based on this whole situation that the pandemic has caused already.
yeah, I mean, firstly, I think you can do a lot. You can do a lot with your vote. You can do a lot with being an advocate for folks. I don't think you're, just an undergrad student. And I think that's the one thing that I would like to, I was going to say it for the end, but I'll say it now, is that you have a lot more power than you think you do. And I would use it. I would use your power, your knowledge to effect change. And even as an undergrad, I can tell you, when I was doing my public health degree at Brown, there was one of my attendings there, he had shared with me, because he'd gotten a lot of requests to help undergrads with medical school applications. And he had shared with me, he's like, the training that you have, even as an undergrad in the United States, a lot of times that's more education than, folks get all over the world. So don't sell yourself short. The fact that you've already made it to this level, for a lot of folks in the world, they're not getting that level of education. You already know a lot more. So I would say you can advocate for those folks. You can be involved in health policy, because when you're looking at folks in Sacramento or in Washington, D.C., and who's up there talking or testifying, hopefully, I know C-SPAN isn't the most exciting channel, and I don't really watch C-SPAN on a regular basis, but if you ever watch C-SPAN, you'll see like there's folks that are coming up and testifying, and it can be, oftentimes it can be anybody, but who do you think they want to hear from, or who do you think they take seriously when they see up there? It's young folks. It's folks who are going to be the future. It's not like somebody who has an agenda or who's come in. It's when there's somebody young who's going to be going into that field. So if I'm in medicine, I'm usually getting the medical students or the residents to go up there and speak in Sacramento or speak in Washington, D.C., because they're the most effective. When the senators, when the legislators, they see the young people who are going to be the future of medicine up there talking about a specific issue, that's much more powerful. That's much more impactful. And I honestly do believe, if there's one thing that's been humbling for me, is that I think young people like yourselves, I think, have a lot more answers than fixed. I think part of the reason why things happen is because it's either tradition or this is how the way things are done, and might not necessarily be the right way to go. Just like when I was talking to the reporter about school reopenings, it was kind of eye-opening for me that nobody was talking to actual students. Even when you're talking about undergrad, campuses, even at UCLA, no one's talking to the actual students about how would you design a safe reopening, or what would you want in a reopening of a school. And I think this is where, for you guys, I think hopefully you're getting involved, and hopefully this is where you can speak up and talk about, well, this is what I think as somebody undergoing, as somebody who's experiencing this. I think if you're applying to med school, or I don't know so much about research, but at least for med school, I always want to see something about volunteerism. And so even if you're volunteering, you're seeing that disparity, and you can actively be involved in helping, somebody reduce that disparity. So. I know it's not an easy answer, but I'm a psychiatrist. I'm better at listening than I am at talking.
No, that was really helpful. Thank you.
I think to like build off on that, would there be, like, looking back, any like habits, like good habits you would recommend that undergraduates try to work on through these 4 years that maybe you wish you would have worked on more, or that you think will be like helpful in the years to come after we graduate?
Yeah, be active in NUS. I think um, that's definitely something that I wish I'd been more active in organized parts of, or organized parts of undergrad life. And I wasn't. I had a good time, but I don't think I did as much with organized activities. And so I would say, being involved in that. One of the things that, again, I know that I am biased as a psychiatrist, but I think it's come to me late is self-care. And when I say self-care, I don't mean, just go do yoga, or I mean actually trying to understand what makes you happy, what's going to make you happy, and to take care of yourself in that way. And it's not going to be, you're not going to know at your age, you're not going to know when you're in your 30s or 40s or 50s, but at least to be thinking about that critically, about what is it that motivates you and excites you. And I think that's something that I certainly didn't think about as an undergrad, because you're just too busy taking it all in, and sometimes you're too busy doing other things, having fun, which, and I would say, have fun in a healthy way. Yeah, I'm trying to think of what other things as an, I can tell you, it's not advice, but I can tell you some of the classes that stick out to me, even as a neuroscience major. I think the classes that stuck out to me the most from undergrad was a class like psychology of architecture. It was so far out there, but it really challenged, it challenged how I thought about space as a design. It challenged how I thought about even the brain and neuroscience. And I think if there's one thing when I look back on my undergraduate experiences in neuroscience that I appreciate the most, as far as how it's evolved over that time, is that there's neuroscience in everything now. And it's just so cool to see how neuroscience is not just limited to this academic discipline. Neuroscience is obviously in medicine, but you're getting neuroscience in the arts. You're getting neuroscience in the media. It's everywhere. And so I think trying to find your outside passions and kind of melding it with what you're doing is what I'd say is really important to do. And if you like yoga, do yoga. I'm not trying to say don't do yoga. It was great.
Awesome, thank you. That was great advice.
Hi, Dr. Dube.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you can describe more of your work-life balance throughout residency and like fellowship and like your established career, and like specifically in comparison to like other specialties. Like you were touching on earlier how before you were pursuing like psychiatry, you were interested in like neurosurgery and like neurology.
Are you asking like the difference between like psychiatric residency versus the other residencies? Or are you asking in general about residency?
No, like more specifically, like how you balance between like your work situation and your life, and like compared to like other like people if they were pursuing like neurosurgery or neurology.
Yeah, well, I mean, they're very different. They're very different fields. There's some things that you have in common. So I think neurosurgery is a lot more physically taxing. You're a lot more physically involved, whereas psychiatry is a lot more psychologically taxing. So what you're going to build and what you're going to need as far as strengths are going to be slightly different. For neurosurgery, I think you want physical and emotional wellness and everything, but for neurosurgery, you're going to have to build the level of stamina of being able to, stand for 8 hours or whatever hours on end, doing your surgery and being able to take short breaks when you need to and subbing in. So you have to be able to do that. Whereas something like psychiatry, you're going to have to be able to, you're going to have to work on your own emotional issues. So for example, in child and adolescent psychiatry, I would have to definitely work on issues that I faced as a teenager, because those are going to come up when I treat folks. So it's a very different kind of skill set. It's a very different kind of wellness that I'm going to have to focus on, as opposed to other fields. Work-life balance in general in medicine is hard. It's not like, I don't know too many specialties that are easy. So if you're under the impression that psychiatry is easy, it's not. I mean, it's still very taxing, and there aren't too many specialties that are easy in terms of the medical subspecialties. I think things have changed because of requirements. So a lot of ACGME, the accrediting body of residencies, they've made a lot of requirements, and so things have changed where wellness is built in. Sometimes I think it's to the detriment of care and detriment of wellness, because they're sort of imposing wellness on you as opposed to you doing your own wellness or finding out about your own wellness. Things that are going to be important are your friendships and your relationships, like whether it's psychiatry, whether it's neurosurgery, whether it's plastic surgery or orthopedics, any of it, you're going to be interpersonal relationships that are going to really, really change things. You're not going to get to see much of the city wherever you train. You're going to get to do stuff, but really it's about doing stuff with the people you're around and having a good group of people that you're going to be around who are going to support you. To give you some not so glamorous statistics about medical school and residency, med students have one of the highest divorce rates. So if you go into med school in a relationship, there's a very high probability or possibility that you're going to be facing a lot of stress and strain on your romantic relationship. Residencies are slightly lower, but even residents have a high rate of divorce and relationships falling apart. So it definitely puts a lot of strain, especially if it's somebody from a non-medical background. That's why you see a lot of physicians marrying a lot of other physicians, or you have folks in like the healthcare fields marrying each other, because otherwise it's hard to understand what somebody's going through. I'm not saying that it's not impossible, and sometimes I think it's actually healthier to have somebody outside, but it puts a lot of strain. So it just tells you. The other thing that they don't talk about is suicide rates. Medical school and residencies, there are suicides that happen. Nobody publishes this data because nobody wants to be known as a school that had those suicides. And so even as a psychiatrist, it's hard to find that data. One of the things that I used to do, I was faculty at UCI 2 years back. And when I was faculty at UCI, I used to see non-psychiatric residents. And so I would treat folks that were residents in other specialties like family medicine and surgery. I would see them for their psychiatric needs. And it was one of the most rewarding things I did, because it doesn't matter if I'm a psychiatrist or a surgeon or an ER physician, I know what they're going through. And that experience, it's universally tough. I don't want to make it sound like it's universally tough and it's brutal and it dehumanizes you. I think there are aspects of medicine that are dehumanizing and that need to be changed. But I do feel like there are some, you should know going in that medicine is not, it's not going to be easy by any means. It doesn't matter what field of medicine you go into, and self-care is going to be important. It's going to be important to, have your parents and your family or whoever's around you know that this is going to be a very tough time for you, and that they're going to have to be understanding of that. So preparing them just as much as preparing yourself is going to be important. For me, if I can tell you personally what stuff I like. I like traveling, and I still manage to, on my vacations, travel. So when I did have time off, I would go travel. I like to read, so that's easy to do anywhere I'm at. And that wasn't very hard, and so I could do that. And I was able to reconnect with friends. I think the first year of training and the second year of training, I lost a lot of those connections. But as you move on, as you kind of feel yourself out, I was able to reconnect with a lot of old friends and kind of reestablish those relationships. Um, I don't know. I think almost every physician I know, unless they're lying, but almost every physician I know has had doubts while they're going through medical school, while they're going through residency or fellowship training, and so doubt, is a part of the process. But at least I can tell you that I'm certainly happy that I came through. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you.
Okay, so we want to be mindful of your time, Dr. Dube. So maybe if there's like a final quick question that anyone wants to ask, we can finish up with that. Otherwise, I'll start wrapping up.
Yeah, and Ivy she has my email. So if any of you guys have questions, feel free to reach out. I mentioned this last year too. There is an etiquette to emailing because otherwise I forget who you are. And so if you do email closer than later. So don't email me like 4 months out. Tell me, because I have no idea who you are. If you are going to email me in like relatively short period, and let me know where you saw me or where I saw you. And so, like this event, and then just ask. I think this goes for not just me, for everybody you try, you see or you want to reach out to, because I think most of us are pretty happy to talk to you and pretty happy to share our experiences, but it also helps to know, who we're talking to. And so, yeah, final questions.
Okay, well, if no one has any other questions, we want to thank you, Dr. Dube, for coming and talking to us. As I said, and now as everyone else knows, you're highly, highly qualified. So we're very, very honored to host you at NUS. I know we probably only learned 1% of the things that you know, so we hope to keep hosting you in future meetings. But thank you so much again for coming and speaking to us and being so honest about the whole process. It's very hard to come across all this information.
Don't sell yourself short. I keep saying that. Don't sell yourself. It's like you guys are probably too young, but maybe you've heard of Captain Planet. It's like Captain Planet would say, when your powers combine. So you can do a lot more than you think. But thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to come back to neuroscience at UCLA.
Thank you so much. I'll stop recording now.